You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
The modern competition conflict cycle seems to be focused largely around tech development. How technology is developed, where it comes from, who owns the IP seems to be quite a big one. But a war's always fought around tech. How is technology identified as a war winner? And who are the men and women that go out of their way to make sure that technology ends up in their own forces' hands? G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast, the only podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. And I am your host, the humblest host you know, mainly because my co-host of our other shows is on holiday at the moment. So I'm all you've got. Thanks very much for all the iTunes reviews, the support, and those new subscribers on our own social media network, the TDP community. It's great having you people support me. One, I like interacting with you, but more importantly, your subscriptions help keep the lights on at TDP Studios. If I had to pay my own way, I think we know that I'd be doing this from a cardboard box. Now, I talked a little bit about tech development, and we know that I have a little bit of a role in this during the daylight hours. However, the history of how military capability is developed is almost unique to each different type of capability. And quite recently, I've had a chance to have a read through a book about how radar was not just developed but sought after and prioritised by Churchill, and in so doing, certain types of forces that we now know as a norm kind of went through their birthing period. But I can't actually explain it all to you because, as you know, I'm not the subject matter expert on anything that happens on this show. So I get in a guest. And my guest today is Damian Lewis. Damien is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into over 40 languages worldwide. For decades, he worked as a war and conflict reporter for the world's major broadcasters, reporting from across Africa, South America, the Middle East, and the Far East, and winning numerous awards. His books include the World War II classics SAS Ghost Patrol, Churchill's Secret Warriors, The Nazi Hunters, and Hunting the Nazi Bomb. Over a dozen of his books have been made or are being made into movies or TV drama series, and several have been adapted as plays for the stage. And I think this is the first time we've had someone whose work has been adapted for the stage, which is brilliant. We've had people who have adapted work for the stage, but not no one who's had their own work adapted for the stage. That's quite excellent. And also our second war correspondent on the our third war correspondent on the show, and I did tell the listeners I would make an effort to get more war correspondents on the show because they have a different point of view of the battlefield. Damien, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm obviously a big fan of the kind of shows you do, so good to be talking to you.
Now, Damien, before we start talking about your latest book, Churchill's Shadow Raiders, and the radar, which is just it's quite an interesting story. The subtitle of The Race to Develop Radar, the Second World War's invisible secret weapon. I actually am interested in understanding what motivated you to write about conflict.
Yeah, well, like you say, I spent 20 years reporting from war zones across the world. And I guess I was more concentrating, as war reporters tend to, on the impacts of war on the victims of it. So, as you know, wars are fought increasingly with the victims being, innocent civilians. That's been a tendency of modern warfare. And, war becomes embedded in the blood. And having spent those 2 decades reporting on war and having had to stop, I had spinal surgery about 15 years ago. I'm very lucky to be alive. Very lucky not to be severely disabled. I turned my hand to writing. In fact, I was approached by a publisher to write a book about one of the subjects I've been reporting on as a war reporter. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of the watershed moment. I'd never thought about writing a book before. It was a #1 bestseller internationally, and I can't. The rest, as they say, I guess is history.
That's a perfect segue because we're going to actually be talking about history. And one thing I do like doing, and some of the listeners who've read my book reviews, I do like reading work written by journalists because the way that you write is very, very clear. And I'm not saying that my academic guests on this show don't write clearly. They are excellent books to go to sleep to. But what I like about the way journalists write is you can churn through a journalist's book pretty quickly because you know how to keep the reader engaged. And flicking through the Churchill's Shadow Raiders, it was great. Again, reading a book written in a way that sort of drives the engagement with it. It's not a dry, dusty work. So I've talked it up, but what we want to talk about is the race to develop the radar, which is what you write about in this book. Are you able to provide our listeners with a brief overview? Make sure you don't give away the ending because we actually want people to buy your book and find out if the radar was ever developed. But if you just give us a bit of an idea of what the book's about.
Yeah, so at the kind of outset of World War II, Britain's top radar experts believed that Britain had uniquely developed radar, that only we had it. And of course, we had ringed the British coastline with chain HOMAR radar towers, which were going to prove crucial in the Battle of Britain. The truth was that the Germans had actually developed radar long before we had. Initially, it was a ship-based radar system, and they also had it. And in fact, their technology was ahead of ours. And there were one or two young, thrusting, intelligent, maverick British scientists who suspected this was the case. And as the losses of our aircraft, particularly the bomber squadron, started to mount exponentially, losses which we knew were unsustainable, they began to fear very much it was German radar that was vectoring the flak, the searchlights, and the German night fighters in particular onto our fleets of warplanes. And so the mission really became to find the German radar, to try and assess what it consisted of, and then eventually to steal one of the top secret pieces so we could, copy it, study it, fire it back into life, Frankenstein-like, and try and work out how to defeat it in the air and in the skies.
It's interesting. You talk about the scientists, and now I've quite a bit of contact with technology development teams within defence industry, within academia, and also within defence departments. And it's interesting when we talk about their different understandings of field requirements and the different types of branches that are stood up. Now, in the book, you talk about a particular branch called the Telecommunications Research Establishment, or the TRE. Who was the TRE, and what was their mission?
So TRE was basically our top secret radar research establishment, and I guess really they had two chief objectives. One was to develop our own radar, both defensively and also offensively, so to guide in fighters and bombers, especially at night, to guide bombers onto U-boats at sea, that kind of thing. And of course, their other sister objective was to try and work out what radar capabilities the enemy had, and then to try to work out how to defeat and confound that. And so TRE was staffed up by hundreds of young men, top scientists, and because their work was so secretive, they were often, and sadly abused on the streets of Britain, because there were these young men wandering around, often in civilian dress, not in uniform, for obvious reasons. It was top secret what they were doing. They couldn't tell anybody what they were up to for reasons of secrecy.
Yeah.
And so they were often accused of being draft dodgers and basically cowards, when actually they were doing some of the most crucial work to winning the war. And it was TRE scientists who became more and more convinced as the war went on, so in late 1940, early 1941, that the Germans not only had radar, but their capabilities were in excess of our own, and those were going to lead to the Germans winning the war in the air, which was absolutely vital to the loss or the retaking of Western Europe.
It's interesting how you talk about the draft dodging, like the cowardice accusations. It's hard for us to relate in modern day times because most of society don't have contact with the people that are going and fighting wars, particularly for the Western nations at the moment. It's the anniversary of September 11 while we're recording this, and you think about the past 20 years of war, or roughly 20 years, how those wars have affected our society is very different to what London would have been experiencing in the Second World War, where everyone in the city, everyone in Britain was engaged in the war effort in some way. And so when we think of research scientists developing military tech, it's very different. We don't have modern day technology development teams getting abused in the street for being cowards. In fact, they're probably quite comfortable in their work and still highly classified, but they probably don't have the same sort of pressures that we would have seen with the TRE. But we also generally don't think of them in the field. Now, I say this having worked with scientists in the field when I was in the military. So I know that scientists do deploy to the field because I've housed them. I've made sure my warrant officer looked after them. And if you really want to entertain a warrant officer, let him put him in charge of looking after some scientists in the field. They have a field day. But there was actually one scientist in your book that is something I hadn't experienced, and that was a scientist who found himself in an assault force.
Mm-hmm.
How did this technologist find himself on the front line of the Second World War?
Well, it's an incredible story. So eventually, the British reconnaissance squadrons captured one of these German paraboloid dishes. So these dish-shaped radar, very small mobile radar units on the French cliff tops. And they realized that they had to go in and try and steal one of these top secret, groundbreaking German pieces of radar.
Mm.
And so they put together a force. It was going to be the second only airborne raid ever undertaken by Allied forces, the first being in the year before in Italy. And it would be the first airborne raid ever launched from British shores. So this was a hell of a big deal. Yeah. And what the raiding force realised as the departure date approached was that they would be fine to go in and seize the site, rout the German defenders, etc., etc. But when it came to taking apart a complex, delicate, highly sensitive, precious piece of radar kit, they obviously had no one in their number who was able to do that.
Yeah,
and there was a shopping list of at least 10 different pieces of kit that the boffins really needed to get their hands on, from the aerial through to the actual labels on the device, which would yield vital intelligence. And so they first approached a chap at TRE, one of the top radar scientists there, and said, we're going to put you through emergency airborne parachute training, and you're going to drop in with the assault force. And then they very quickly realized if the assault went wrong, and that top British radar scientist was captured, the mission would spectacularly backfire, because then the Germans would learn all of our radar secrets when they interrogated him.
Yeah.
And so eventually what they settled upon was there was an RAF, a flight sergeant, who was a radar technician. So he knew how to take apart and put together bits of radar, even if he didn't understand all the intricacies of how the technology worked. And so he was sent on a train to London. And when he arrived at the headquarters in London and met a senior officer there, he was told he had volunteered for a top secret mission. And of course, he'd done no such thing. And he said, well, I haven't volunteered and no idea what I'm here for. And the commanding officer said, well, would you volunteer? And he said, well, can you tell me something about the mission? And the commanding officer said, well, no, it's top secret. Of course I can't tell you. So the flight sergeant said, well, is it going to be dangerous? And he said, there was a war on. Of course it's going to be dangerous. Now, will you volunteer? And so the flight sergeant said, well, yeah, I guess I will then. So he was volunteered. Trained in six parachute jumps to earn his wings. Obviously had no idea when he volunteered, he parachuting behind enemy lines or any idea about the mission. And then that chap, Flight Sergeant Cox, was parachuted in with the 120 strong assault force. Under heavy fire, oversaw the taking apart of what was called the Würzburg radar dish, and the taking of that from the cliff tops down to the beaches to be spirited away from German hands by the waiting flotilla of British ships. Incidentally, commanded by a Royal Australian Navy Commander Cook, who was one of the true heroes of the mission, an extraordinary character who'd had 2 ships already sunk under him. And he was under strict orders, Cook, who commanded the Tormentor flotilla, this flotilla of waiting little ships, motor torpedo boats, landing craft. He was under strict orders only to go in to collect the raiding party and the radar if he received the radio signal, or the very signals, the flare signals, to clear him into the beach, saying it was in British hands. He did not receive that signal by the cut-off point, and he sent his flotilla in anyway. The fog had come down, so that's why he didn't see it. Sent the flotilla in anyway and saved the day. So, a real hero of the day.
Well, I could tell he was a real hero just by his surname. His luck of having two ships sunk from under him. I've definitely got to be related to him. Although I've never worn white. I do know that the Royal Australian Navy do allow people to have beards, and so I might just chat with them, see if they need an army reservist to come across and work for them. Maybe I can match Cook's record. Although I would probably have to go to war for that, and I'm not really keen on wars. Having been there, they're not that nice. It's an amazing story, and we know that the British airborne forces, they had their genesis in the Second World War, and we also know that the Special Air Service Regiment was formed in the Second World War. And I know that you've written about these lads before. But it's interesting because they also had a bit, the precursor to special forces, commandos. In Australia, the commando regiment is a special forces regiment, whereas in the UK, a commando is, about a brigade-sized force of Royal Marines, right? Mm-hmm. So the precursor to special forces had a bit of a part to play in the acquisition of radar technology. Can you tell us a little bit about their role as, the precursor to special forces and how they supported missions like this?
Basically, the birth of special forces in the UK is in itself an utterly extraordinary story. So, 6th of June, D-Day. Dunkirk has just happened. Okay.
Yeah.
And Churchill has hailed the saving of tens of thousands of Allied soldiers from the jaws of defeat and shame on the French beaches, and 48 hours after that, so 48 hours after, Allied forces have been thrown off the European continent and suffered abject defeat in 1940. Churchill is approached by a very a maverick and little appreciated commander of World War II, who basically says, look, why don't we form the British version of the Boer Commandos? So these were the irregular Boer forces who fought in the Boer War against the British, and around about 25,000 to 50,000 of them, mounted on horseback, carrying their own hunting weapons, dressed in their farming clothes, basically tied down 5 or 6 times that number of British troops, and were very, very successful in guerrilla fighting.
Yeah.
And so this commander approaches Churchill and says, look, why don't we form the British version of the Boer Commandos? Because we have to prove we can take the fight back to the enemy. And now they're spread out all along the European coastline. That makes them vulnerable. And Churchill, of course, who'd been in the Boer War, he'd reported from it. He'd been captured by the Boers. He'd escaped from captivity, thought this was an absolutely wonderful idea and grasped it with both hands. That was the moment the commandos were formed. And not only that, bear in mind, we've just suffered a crushing defeat. Churchill says to this commander, you got my absolute full blessing. He gave the order immediately. The force of 5,000 to 10,000 commandos should be raised. And he said, you have to get a raid back across the channel to attack the enemy before the end of the month. That gave him 3 weeks. He had no men. He had no machines. That no one had ever been trained and no one had ever done it before. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they did. Before the end of the month, riding in RAF crash boats, which are basically the inflatables that you use to pluck downed airmen out of the sea. 120 commandos on Operation, what was it called? Sorry, it's escaped me. Anyway, crossed the channel at night, attacked the German outpost, caused some casualties, took some prisoners, but most importantly, the next day it was all over the British and the American press that Britain had the heart and the will to fight back. And that was the birth of the commandos and special forces. And it was the descendants of those forces, okay, who then went on to form airborne raiding forces, because Churchill's, a visionary man, absolute visionary man at the time, who'd seen the Germans launch the first ever airborne missions when they took the Belgian forts at the outbreak of the Second World War. He'd seen those German airborne raids take place. He'd seen how they landed glider-borne and parachute-borne troops, and it was stunningly successful. And Churchill, shortly after ordering the formation of 5,000 to 10,000 commandos, said he also wanted a 5,000 strong airborne force. Okay, and so it was from that appreciation of the need that attack is the best form of defence, that we had to prove we had the will and the ability to fight back if Britain was going to stand firm. It was from there that the whole birth of the Special Air Service and the concept of Special Forces operations was born.
Churchill, whether you love him or hate him, visionary is probably a great description. I love that. You talked a little bit about how he was captured in the Boer War. He was over there as a war correspondent at the time. I think he was captured from a train.
That's right, absolutely,
yeah, captured from a train, and his escape. I think part of his escape, he dressed as a woman for a period of it. But that may be a fair few. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it's a fascinating story for those who haven't looked into Churchill's younger days. Quite a red-headed rogue, actually. So a modern, quite when you think of him and you think of the Second World War, where his leadership kind of helped Britain recoup and retain the initiative and win the war. You don't really think of what he was like as a younger man, but when you read about his pre-parliamentary days, you can kind of see the Churchill of the 1940s being shaped. So I'd be remiss not to sort of mention a little bit more about Churchill and his role in technology, I suppose, technology development. Your book's about the development of the radar. Churchill's name's on the front cover of the book. Can you tell us a little bit about Churchill's role as the wartime leader of the UK in the development of cutting edge technology, in the desire to have radar to beat the Germans, to take the Germans' secrets, just basically Churchill and this high tech risk taking to develop this technology?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Churchill was, not only was he, a visionary leader and commander, but he was also a very accomplished amateur scientist. And he believed, just as much as he believed in the fact that special forces and irregular forces would help win the war, he believed technology was crucial too. I'll just give you one example. So fairly early on in the Blitz, the experts at TRE and other scientists in other establishments began to suspect the Germans had a very, very accurate guidance system, which was locking their bombers onto targets. Okay, because they were just bombing too accurately, especially at night. And they came up with a theory that the Germans had a radio beam system, so they were basically broadcasting these beams along which their bombers could fly, with an intersecting beam, and where the second beam intersected, they released the bombs. Does that make sense? So these ideas were put up to the chief military commanders, and they were absolutely dismissed. But everybody said this is impossible. You can't bend beams around the curved surface of the Earth. It's not possible. Therefore, they can't be doing it. And then one of these young scientists got a chance to have an audience with Churchill at the cabinet and actually explain what the fear was. And Churchill ordered immediately that the RAF make available airframes to fly along the suspected paths of the beams to try to pick them up with radio detectors and locate their source so that their sources could be bombed. Now imagine how dangerous that was going to be. You'd have to have air crew and scientists riding on those airplanes with the right detection equipment, flying down the beams along which hundreds of German aircraft were in theory flying. So these are pretty high stakes missions. But he did that against all the advice and all the will of the RAF's top commanders who said this was impossible. And of course, lo and behold, the beams were proven to exist. And when they found them and they detected their frequencies, the boffins at TRE were able to bend and corrupt the frequencies. So the German bombing fleets on many occasions actually ended up not just bombing the wrong places, but ended up flying around in circles. In some places, they'd landed in fields or on beaches, believing they were back in France, and actually they were in the UK. So crucial to winning the Battle of Britain and surviving the Blitz in the Second World War. Just one example of Churchill's groundbreaking, visionary belief in science, embracing science as a means to win the war. Not only that, believing that things we had not seen before in terms of technological developments in war were possible and had to be investigated and defended against.
Yeah, and I guess I do know there's a few tankies that listen to this show. They don't really understand. A lot of people don't know Churchill's involvement in developing tanks. He was leading the project. They're called tanks because the code name was water tanks, right?
That's right.
And just big fan of technology development for the national interest. And if you are in this space, if you're in defence industry, or if you're interested in capability in tech development when it really, really counts, understanding Churchill's roles in both world wars, very, very interesting sort of way of understanding how leaders grasp the idea of taking a risk on technology development, taking that leap forward in innovation, accepting risk, and then seeing what, then applying it with smart and putting faith in smart people, right? We will go to our bonus question, which is, as I mentioned before, we have some subscribers who keep the lights turned on. So we'll just take a quick pause. And Damien, thank you very much for that fascinating answer to the bonus question. For those people who didn't listen to it because you don't subscribe, sucked in, because it was great. But now, Damien, we will talk about my final question. Now, this is one I ask of all guests, and it relates to our mission on the show. And that's to define wars in as many ways possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, did. And so I ask each guest to finish a sentence, and this sentence is war is. So, Damien, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
Well, I guess war is hell, but it's also where you can feel most alive.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And for those listeners that didn't listen to the bonus question, those ones that I just called suckers, there's a reference in there that you should subscribe to, and then you'll get it. But war is where you feel most alive. War is hell, and it's where you feel most alive. An original definition, and you know what? After nearly 100 episodes, it's pretty hard to get definitions that haven't been thrown out there. So that's the beauty of having diverse guests, because I've only had 3 war correspondents on here. So and I think you've probably all given very similar questions. When we talk about the rush that war correspondents have and the passion for their work, all 3 of them have talked about that: Australian, American, and now a Brit war correspondent. So, Damien, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much. Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
Now, ladies and gents, please check out Damien's book, Churchill's Shadow Raiders: The Race to Develop the Radar, World War II's Secret Weapon. It is it's absolute cracking read. You'll punch through it pretty quickly, and you'll love it. And also, it's got Invictus, the poem at the start of it. And I was trying to actually think of the name of the poem the other day, the Captain of My Soul quote. So I'm glad that this interview happened, because I was able to remember that. Now I've just got to remember why I was trying to remember it. Listeners, we are coming up to 100 episodes, so there's something a little bit different for our 100th episode, a different kind of interview. Stick around for it. I hope you'll enjoy it. Please check out Damien's book. You'll find his book in the show notes. There'll also be a link to his website in the show notes. Check it out, because he has a raft of books that I know most of the listeners who I interact with on social media will be interested in these types of books, particularly because, as I said, they're an enjoyable read as well. So you'll be able to get through them pretty quickly. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.